3,000 years ago, a river gave birth to eternity. Beneath the same moon that shines tonight, an entire civilization dreamed of forever. And tonight, as you close your eyes, we return to where it all began. The banks of the Nile, under a sky that has never changed. Welcome to History for Sleep, where the past drifts softly into dreams. If you like what I do here, subscribe now and let tomorrow's dream begin where this one ends. Chapter 1: The River That Birthed a Civilization. The story of ancient Egypt begins not with a king or a temple, but with a river. The Nile, long, patient, and eternal, flows from deep within the heart of Africa, carrying life through one of the driest places on earth. For thousands of years, its steady rhythm shaped the destiny of an entire people. Each year, the waters of the Nile would rise, flooding the valleys on either side. When the flood receded, it left behind a dark, fertile soil, a gift that allowed grain to grow in a place where rain almost never fell. To the ancient Egyptians, this was more than a natural cycle. It was a miracle. It was proof that their gods were kind and that the world was in balance. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich soil left by the river. Beyond that narrow green strip lay the Deshret, the Red Land, the endless desert, harsh and lifeless. Life, for them, was the border between these two worlds, the green of plenty and the gold of eternity. The Nile was more than water. It was the great artery of civilization. Boats moved along its calm surface, carrying people, goods, and stories. The river was the highway of Egypt, a path that connected villages, temples, and tombs along its banks. From the delta in the north to the southern lands of Nubia, everything flowed along this liquid thread. To the Egyptians, time itself was like the river, endless, repeating, eternal. Each sunrise was the rebirth of the god Ra, sailing across the sky in his golden boat. Each sunset was his descent into the underworld, promising to rise again. The people lived within this sacred rhythm, sowing when the waters withdrew, harvesting when the sun returned, and waiting patiently for the floods that renewed their world. The first settlements along the Nile were small villages, clusters of mud brick homes surrounded by fields of barley and emmer wheat. Families tended their crops, fished the waters, and watched the horizon for the rising flood. Over centuries, these villages grew into towns, and those towns became kingdoms. In time, the kingdoms united under a single ruler, the first pharaoh. Thus began one of the longest and most extraordinary civilizations in human history. To live by the Nile was to live with certainty. The river never failed. Its floods were the promise of food, of survival, and of order. In a world of chaos and sand, the Nile was peace itself. The Egyptians measured their calendar by it. They divided the year into 3 seasons: the season of flooding, the season of growth, and the season of harvest. Their lives were not governed by armies or kings, but by the gentle, predictable rise and fall of the water. Every prayer, every festival, every act of daily life was bound to the rhythm of the Nile. To stand by the river at dawn, as an Egyptian might have done thousands of years ago, was to see the world reborn. The mist rising from the water, the first light of the sun catching on distant temples, the slow movement of boats heading downstream. It was a sight that must have felt both ordinary and sacred. It is said that the Nile gave Egypt its body, the land, the soil, the crops, but the people gave it its soul. From that unity of water and faith came the art, architecture, and stories that still stand today, carved into the stone of time. And so, under the watchful gaze of the gods, The Nile continued its eternal flow, silent, slow, and certain, carrying with it the heartbeat of Egypt. Chapter 2. Temples and Tombs Beneath the Sun. Along the Nile's edge, rising from the golden dust, stand the great monuments of ancient Egypt, the temples and tombs that became the language of eternity. They were not built for the living alone, but for gods and spirits, for the unseen world that existed beyond the horizon. In the ancient mind, there was no divide between the sacred and the ordinary. To build a temple was to participate in the divine order, to help the gods maintain the balance between life and chaos. Every stone lifted toward the sky was a prayer, every carving a hymn to eternity. The Egyptians believed that the world had been created from the first mound of earth that rose from the waters of chaos. Each temple was a reflection of that act, a recreation of creation itself. As one walked deeper into a temple, from sunlight into shadow, from noise into silence, it was like moving backward in time, toward the beginning of all things. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor were living cities of stone. Their columns soared like forests. Their walls told stories in color and line. Within them, priests tended to the statues of gods, offering food, incense, and song. Few ordinary people ever entered the inner sanctuaries. These were not places for crowds, but for communion, quiet conversations between gods and men. To the west of the Nile lay the land of the dead, where the sun set and where the tombs were built. There, in the Valley of the Kings, long corridors were carved into the living rock, decorated with scenes from sacred texts. Each tomb was a journey, a map for the soul, guiding the pharaoh from this world to the next. To build such a tomb was to prepare for eternity. Artisans worked for decades, painting ceilings with stars, walls with gods, floors with prayers. Every inch of space carried meaning. The colors, deep blues, golds, and reds, still glow today, even after thousands of years of darkness. The workers who built these wonders lived in a place called Deir el-Medina, a small, organized village near the Valley of the Kings. They were paid in food and beer, and they passed their skills from parent to child. Their lives, though ordinary, were touched by the sacred. Each stroke of a chisel, each painted symbol was a step toward immortality. Not their own, but their kings. The pyramids, those immense shapes rising from the desert, were among the earliest and greatest of Egypt's tombs. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu, has stood for more than 4,000 years. Its stones weigh tons, yet they fit together with a precision so fine that even today it humbles the imagination. It was not built by slaves, as once believed, but by thousands of skilled workers who labored in rhythm with the seasons, fed and housed by the state. To stand before the pyramids at sunrise, when the first light touches their tips, is to witness something that seems beyond human hands. They were more than graves. They were symbols of order, of divine harmony. Their perfect lines mirrored the rays of the sun, pointing the way to heaven. But temples and tombs were more than monuments to power. They were messages, carved prayers, speaking across time. Even now, when the desert wind moves through the broken doorways and over the fallen stones, it feels as though the voices of their makers still linger there, whispering in a language of sand and light. In Egypt, memory itself was sacred. To be remembered was to live forever. The names of kings and gods were carved deep into the stone so that even if the body perished, the spirit would remain. This was the true purpose of the monuments, not to mark death, but to defy it. And so the temples stood, their walls bright with color, their halls filled with incense and the sound of hymns. When the sun rose each morning, it illuminated the carvings, breathing life once more into scenes of gods and humans, reminders that every dawn was a new creation, and every sunset a gentle passage into. Chapter 3. The Daily Life of Ancient Egyptians. Life in ancient Egypt unfolded slowly, in harmony with the river and the sun. Each day began before dawn, as the first light touched the horizon and the air cooled from the desert night. Families stirred in small mud-brick homes. The smell of baking bread and the soft murmur of morning voices filled the air. For most Egyptians, life was centered around the land. They were farmers, fishermen, potters, and craftsmen, ordinary people whose days followed the rhythm of the seasons. When the Nile receded after the flood, farmers planted their fields with barley, wheat, and flax. The earth, dark and rich, yielded crops that sustained everyone, from the simplest laborer to the mightiest pharaoh. Work was not hurried. It moved with the pace of the day, slow, methodical, certain. Men plowed the fields using wooden tools drawn by oxen. Women ground grain, brewed beer, wove linen, and cared for children. Life was communal, balanced between work, family, and ritual. In the heat of the afternoon, the air shimmered and work paused. People sought shade beneath palm trees or sat along the riverbanks, where the water offered relief. Children played in the shallows, laughing, their voices carrying across the quiet fields. Homes were simple but well made. Mud bricks, shaped by hand and baked by the sun, kept the interior cool. Inside, walls were whitewashed to reflect the light, and small niches held oil lamps or figurines of protective gods. Even the poorest homes had symbols of faith, a painted eye of Horus, or a small statue of Bees, the household guardian. Food was humble yet plentiful. Bread, beer, fish, onions, and dates were the staples of Egyptian life. Bread was baked fresh each day, and beer, thick, nutritious, and lightly fermented, was a common drink for adults and children alike. At festivals or celebrations, families shared meat, honey, and sweet cakes flavored with figs. Clothing was light and comfortable, made from linen spun from flax. Men often wore short kilts, women long dresses that draped gracefully to the ankles. Jewelry, even among the poor, was cherished. Beads, copper bracelets, and amulets worn not only for beauty, but for protection. Art and music filled the villages. Harps, flutes, and drums accompanied dances during feasts or at the changing of the seasons. The Egyptians celebrated life as a reflection of divine order, a gift to be honored through work, family, and joy. Though society was structured, it was not without mobility. Skilled workers could rise through service, and scribes, those who could read and write, often began as the children of craftsmen. Education, while rare, was a path to a different life, one bound not to the soil but to the pen. Evenings were quiet. As the sun dipped behind the western hills, families gathered for a final meal. They spoke of the day, offered prayers to the gods, and prepared for rest. The desert cooled, the stars brightened, and the hum of insects replaced the day's voices. Life, though modest, was full, sustained by faith, family, and the rhythm of the eternal river. In Egypt, work and worship were one. To farm the land was to honor the gods. To raise children was to continue the balance of creation. Every action, no matter how small, was part of the great order, what they called ma'at, harmony, truth, and balance. It was the invisible law that held both the heavens and the fields together. And so, generation after generation, Egyptians lived as their ancestors had before them, in peace with the river, in faith with the gods, and in quiet understanding that life itself was sacred. Chapter 4. The Wisdom of the Scribes. Among the many figures who shaped ancient Egypt, few were as respected as the scribes, the keepers of knowledge, the recorders of memory, the guardians of words. To write in that world was to command something close to magic. Most Egyptians could not read or write. The art of writing was a skill taught only to the few, to those who would serve in temples, palaces, and workshops of administration. Scribes learned not just letters, but order, how to measure land, count grain, and record offerings to the gods. Hieroglyphs, the sacred symbols of Egyptian writing, were more than words. Each sign carried meaning, sound, and spirit. A bird, a reed, a wave, a sun. Together they formed a bridge between thought and eternity. To carve them into stone was to make the invisible permanent. The word for writing in ancient Egyptian meant to draw words. It was a visual art, shaped by both precision and imagination. The scribe's hand was trained to balance beauty and accuracy, for every line written was both record and prayer. Scribes worked in quiet places, beneath shaded porches, within temple chambers, or in the cool rooms of government offices. They wrote with brushes made from reeds and ink mixed from soot and ochre. Papyrus scrolls, rolled tightly and tied with cords, filled the archives, thousands of years of human memory resting in silence. Their duties were vast. They recorded harvests, kept accounts, wrote letters for the illiterate, and copied sacred texts for the priests. Some worked directly for the pharaoh, chronicling decrees and victories. Others served in small villages, ensuring that taxes were fair and trades were honored. To be a scribe was to hold power without a sword or throne. They were respected for their intelligence, for their link to the divine. In Egyptian art, scribes are often shown seated cross-legged, scroll on lap, gaze calm and focused, the embodiment of patience and order. One ancient proverb said, "The scribe's reed is mightier than the soldier's blade." Through writing, they preserved Egypt's voice, across generations, across dynasties. Their words carried the will of kings, the laws of the gods, and the stories of ordinary lives. Some scribes became poets, creating verses that still survive today, hymns to the Nile, songs of love, and reflections on death. One wrote, "Man perishes, his corpse turns to dust, but the book makes him remember." To write, then, was to defeat time itself. The art of writing was sacred because it was believed to have been taught by Thoth, the god of wisdom, learning, and the moon. Thoth was the divine scribe of the heavens, recording the deeds of gods and men alike. Every act of writing was an echo of his eternal work. In temples, sacred texts were copied by hand, line by line, to preserve the rituals that kept the world in balance. Errors were rare, for to write a god's name incorrectly was to disturb the cosmic order. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate, an act of creation. In the schools for scribes, young students began by memorizing proverbs and lists. They copied lines for hours until their handwriting was steady and their minds disciplined. Their teachers were strict, for the role they prepared for was vital, to ensure that Egypt's heart continued to beat in ink and parchment. Scribes were not rich, but they were immortalized. The kings built tombs, the scribes built legacies that spoke forever. Even when the empires fell and the stones cracked, their words survived, etched deep into the walls, sealed within papyrus, waiting for new eyes to read them again. It is through their hands that we still know Egypt, its beliefs, its poetry, its life and death. Without the scribes, history itself would have drifted away, like sand over forgotten names. And so, by the light of the moon or the glow of the morning sun, they wrote, patiently, faithfully, word after word, line after line. Their silence was not emptiness, but devotion. Each symbol they drew was a bridge between this world and the eternal one, a whisper of memory that refused to fade. Chapter 5. The Pharaoh and the Gods. In the ancient world of Egypt, power was not merely political, it was divine. At the heart of this belief stood the Pharaoh, the living bridge between heaven and earth. To his people, he was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of order, of Ma'at, the balance that kept the universe from slipping back into chaos. The Pharaoh was both man and God. He was the child of Ra, the sun god, chosen to maintain harmony on earth as the gods did in the heavens. His crown, his scepter, his throne, all were symbols of divine responsibility. To rule Egypt was not to command by force, but to preserve the balance of life, justice, and faith. From the first light of dawn, the pharaoh's duties began. Priests entered the temples to awaken the statues of the gods, washing, clothing, and anointing them as living beings. Incense filled the air. Hymns echoed softly through stone corridors. It was said that when the pharaoh made offerings to the gods, he renewed the strength of the entire world. The pantheon of Egypt was vast and intricate, each deity representing an aspect of life and nature. Radium, the sun, sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. Osiris ruled the afterlife, where souls were judged. Isis, his wife, was the goddess of love and magic, mother of all things. Horus, the falcon-headed god, represented kingship and the sky. And Thoth, the wise ibis-headed scribe, kept record of all that was and would be. For the Egyptians, the divine was everywhere, in the flood of the Nile, in the harvest, in birth and death. The gods were not distant forces, but close companions, woven into every act of daily life. Every prayer, every ritual, every offering was part of the sacred cycle that kept the universe in balance. Temples were the homes of the gods, and the pharaoh was their caretaker. He did not rule by might alone, but through ritual. Each festival, each act of devotion, was a renewal of his sacred bond with heaven. Even in art, the pharaoh was shown larger than life, not because he was a man of great size, but because he stood between worlds. When the pharaoh died, his role did not end. He was believed to ascend to the stars and join the gods. The successor who followed was not merely a new ruler, but a continuation of the same divine presence. The eternal kingship of Egypt flowing unbroken, like the Nile itself. For the people, the pharaoh's existence was reassurance. As long as he performed the sacred rites and upheld Ma'at, the floods would come, the crops would grow, and peace would endure. His life was the living promise of stability. To live under the pharaoh's reign was to live under the light of the gods, steady, protective, and eternal. And though his face might change, his title remained the same: the son of the sun, the keeper of balance, the eternal king. Chapter 6. The Art of the Afterlife. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end. It was a passage, a continuation of existence in a higher, more perfect realm. They believed that just as the sun died each evening and rose again each morning, so too did the human soul. The journey to the afterlife was central to Egyptian belief. It was not a single moment, but a process, one that required preparation, knowledge, and faith. Everything in life was, in some way, a rehearsal for eternity. At the heart of this belief stood Osiris, the god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld. He had once been a living king, betrayed and killed by his brother Set, only to be resurrected by his devoted wife, Isis. Through him, death became not destruction, but renewal. For the soul, known as the Ba, the journey began at death, when it separated from the body. But for the Ba to survive, the body itself had to be preserved, for the soul would return to it each night to rest. Thus arose the sacred art of mummification. The process was long and meticulous. Priests trained in the ritual removed what would decay and preserved what was essential. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen bandages. Hundreds of yards of fabric folded with precision. Amulets were placed between the layers, each holding a prayer of protection. The final wrapping was done with care, the priest murmuring blessings to guide the soul on its journey. When completed, the mummy was placed within a sarcophagus, a coffin carved with images of gods and inscriptions from the Book of the Dead. That book, a collection of sacred texts, was not a single story, but a series of spells and instructions, a guide through the challenges of the underworld. The Egyptians believed that after death, the soul would face judgment in the Hall of Truth. There, the heart of the deceased was weighed against a feather, the symbol of Ma'at, of truth and balance. If the heart was light, free from wrongdoing, the soul was granted eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise of gentle winds, green fields, and endless peace. If it was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, the fearsome creature of judgment. But these were not tales of fear. They were stories of order and hope. They reflected the Egyptian faith in justice, that a life lived rightly would be rewarded, that harmony would prevail beyond death. Tombs were not seen as graves, but as homes for the eternal self. Their walls were painted with scenes of daily life, harvesting, music, feasts, and love. These were not memories, but wishes, depictions of the life the soul hoped to live forever. For the wealthy, tombs were grand, filled with treasures and statues. For the poor, they were simple, yet equally sacred. Each burial, no matter how modest, carried the same prayer, that the soul would live again, safe in the company of the gods. The journey through death was, in truth, a mirror of life, one guided by faith, illuminated by ritual, and protected by love. Even in their deepest mysteries, the Egyptians sought comfort, not despair. To die was to go home, to return to the divine order from which all life came. And so they built, painted, wrote, and prayed, not out of fear of death, but out of devotion to eternity. The land of the living and the land of the dead were not separate, but connected, two halves of a single, unbroken circle. As the sun set each evening over the western desert, Egyptians would look toward the horizon, not with sorrow, but with quiet certainty. For just as the sun would rise again, so too would the soul awaken in the light of the afterlife. Chapter 7. Pyramids and the Meaning of Immortality. The pyramids of Egypt stand not only as stone but as thought, vast, deliberate, and eternal. They rise from the desert as if born from the horizon itself, their sharp lines softened by time, their meaning unchanged. They are symbols of the Egyptian dream, the search for immortality. The earliest pyramids were built over 4,500 years ago, during the reigns of the Old Kingdom's first great kings. They were the resting places of pharaohs, monuments to power, to faith, and to eternity. But to the Egyptians, these were not tombs in the simple sense. They were resurrection machines. sacred stairways to the heavens. Each pyramid began as a simple mound, but over centuries the form evolved, step by step, stone by stone, until it reached the perfection seen at Giza. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was the culmination of that vision. Constructed with over 2 million blocks of limestone, it required generations of workers, engineers, and artists. Not slaves, but skilled laborers bound by belief. Work followed the rhythm of the Nile. When the floods came and fields lay under water, farmers turned their hands to building. They were fed, housed, and honored, for they were serving both their king and their gods. Every stone lifted into place was an act of devotion, a way to ensure that the divine order endured beyond death. The pyramid's shape itself carried meaning. Its 4 sides faced the cardinal points, aligning earth with the heavens. Its peak reached upward to Ra, the sun god, symbolizing the pharaoh's ascent toward eternal life. In this way, architecture became prayer. Geometry became faith. Inside, the corridors led to the burial chamber, a place of deep silence and reverence. Here, the king's body was placed within a sarcophagus, surrounded by treasures, offerings, and sacred texts. These were not possessions for use, but companions for the journey ahead. Gold, though beautiful, had no value in eternity. What mattered were the symbols, the objects that reminded the gods of the pharaoh's devotion. For the Egyptians, immortality was not an escape from the world, but a continuation of it. Life and death were 2 forms of the same existence. The pyramid was a promise that death could be conquered through memory, faith, and balance. As centuries passed, the style of tombs changed. The massive pyramids gave way to hidden chambers in the Valley of the Kings, yet the belief remained the same, that the soul would rise like the morning sun, shining forever in the company of the gods. Even now, thousands of years later, the pyramids keep their silent watch. Beneath the stars, they cast long shadows across the sand, timeless and still. They are Egypt's eternal heartbeat, a rhythm carved in stone, echoing through all of history. To stand before them is to feel what the ancients felt: awe, humility, and wonder. For though empires fall and names fade, the human longing to be remembered never dies. And so the pyramids endure, the oldest dream still standing beneath the endless desert sky. Chapter 8: Love, Family, and Songs of the Nile. Beyond temples and kings, beyond gold and stone, there was the heart of Egypt, its people, their love, their laughter, their songs. For all its grandeur, Egypt was a land built not just on power, but on affection and connection. The ancient Egyptians loved deeply and expressed it beautifully. They left behind poems written on papyrus and carved into tomb walls, words of tenderness that still carry warmth after thousands of years. One such verse reads, "My beloved, your voice is the sweetest of songs. Your presence is water in the desert." Another says, "Each time I see you, it is like the first day of creation." Marriage was not a rigid contract, but a partnership. Husbands and wives were often depicted side by side, equal in height and presence, their hands clasped. Families were close, bound by both affection and duty. Children were considered blessings, and parents cherished them as gifts from the gods. Life was not without hardship, yet the Egyptians found joy in its rhythm. Festivals filled the year, moments of rest and celebration that blended the sacred and the joyful. There were festivals for the gods, for the Nile, for the harvest, and for renewal. Music, laughter, and dance echoed through the villages. The sound of drums, flutes, and harps carried through warm nights. Love songs were sung by workers, by farmers, by women at the river washing linen. Some were romantic, others playful, many deeply poetic. One ancient song compares a lover's heart to a field ready for harvest, a symbol of abundance and devotion. Even in death, love was preserved. Husbands and wives were often buried together. Their tombs showed scenes of shared meals, shared labor, shared eternity. Love, to the Egyptians, did not end with death. It merely crossed into another form. Friendship, too, was treasured. Letters found on ancient papyrus speak of companionship, of missing one another, of the simple kindnesses that made life whole. Their tone feels familiar, a reminder that across millennia the human heart has not changed. The Egyptians also celebrated beauty. They adorned themselves with jewelry, perfumes, and makeup, not out of vanity, but as an expression of harmony. To be beautiful was to reflect divine balance. The dark kohl around the eyes, the bright jewelry of turquoise and gold, these were symbols of protection and joy. Leisure had its place as well. People played board games like senet, an early ancestor of chess and checkers. They swam in the Nile, hunted birds with nets, and picnicked under date palms. There was laughter, song, and story, small joys woven into the fabric of each day. In their art, Egyptians captured not only gods and kings, but also simple affection, a mother holding a child, a couple sharing bread, musicians playing in the sunlight. These scenes remind us that even in an age of pyramids and temples, the greatest monument was the heart itself. To live well was to live in harmony with one's family, one's community, and the eternal order of nature. To love was to reflect the divine. The songs of the Nile were many, songs of work, songs of prayer, songs of love. They rose with the morning and faded with the evening breeze, and though the voices that sang them are long gone, their echoes remain, carried softly by the river that never stops flowing. Chapter 9. The Decline of the Kingdoms. No civilization, however radiant, escapes the passage of time. For Egypt, the decline came not as a single collapse, but as a slow fading of light, centuries of change, challenge, and renewal, each leaving traces in the sand. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramids, had been a time of unmatched stability. Yet, even as the monuments rose, pressures grew. The cost of vast construction projects strained the state, while local governors, once loyal servants, began to seek power for themselves. The unity that had held Egypt together began to fray. After centuries of strength, famine and drought deepened the divisions. The Nile, which had once flooded faithfully each year, faltered. Without its waters, the land could not feed its people. The people turned to their local rulers, and the idea of one divine pharaoh gave way to a patchwork of competing powers. But Egypt did not vanish. It endured through adaptation. The Middle Kingdom emerged, bringing reform and a return to order. Kings from Thebes reunited the land and restored the rituals of Ma'at. Art, literature, and architecture flourished again, calmer, humbler, yet rich with human emotion. Still, the tides of history moved on. Foreigners began to arrive, traders, travelers, and eventually conquerors. The Hyksos came first, introducing horses and chariots. They ruled for a time, but Egypt learned from them, absorbed their tools, and reclaimed its throne. Then came the New Kingdom, Egypt's golden age of empire, under rulers like Thutmose, Akhenaten, and Ramses, the pharaohs reached new heights of power. Their armies marched into Asia, their temples gleamed with gold, their gods were worshipped far beyond the Nile. But power breeds ambition, and ambition often turns inward. Wars drained the treasury, priests gained more influence than kings, and change began to erode the old ways. The new kingdom waned. The priests of Amun held Thebes. Rival dynasties rose in the north. Foreign powers saw opportunity in Egypt's fading unity. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, all left their mark as Egypt's rule passed from one hand to another. Yet, through it all, the Egyptian spirit endured. Even when conquered by Persia, by Greece, and later by Rome, the essence of Egypt, its art, its faith, its calm reverence for eternity remained. Temples were rebuilt, languages evolved, but the rhythm of the Nile flowed unchanged. To the last, Egypt never forgot itself. It became a land of memory, a keeper of the world's oldest wisdom. And though its dynasties fell, its soul survived in the stones, in the symbols, in the quiet pulse of history. The end of Egypt's kingdoms was not destruction, but transformation, the closing of a chapter in a story that had never truly ended. The people who once raised pyramids had built something greater than empire. They had built time itself, carved into the desert, still glowing beneath the sun. Chapter 10: Egypt's Legacy and Eternal Spirit. More than 3,000 years have passed since the last pharaoh ruled. Yet Egypt endures, not in armies or kings, but in memory. Its voice still whispers from the stone. Its gaze still meets us from the walls of tombs. Everywhere we look, traces remain. In art, in architecture, in language, echoes of Egypt ripple through the centuries. The Greeks admired its wisdom. The Romans imitated its style. Even today, when we see the columns of temples, the symmetry of monuments, the balance of design, we are seeing the reflection of an ancient ideal. Egypt's legacy is not only in its grandeur, but in its philosophy. Its people believed in harmony between the world seen and unseen. They taught that the universe was held together by Ma'at, truth, order, and justice. This belief shaped their laws, their art, and their hearts. To live according to Ma'at was to walk in balance, to speak truth, to show kindness, to respect the natural rhythm of the world. In this idea, Egypt offered humanity something timeless, the vision of a peaceful life guided by harmony. The symbols of Egypt became part of world culture. The Ankh, the cross of life. The scarab, symbol of renewal. The eye of Horus, a sign of protection. They endure not as relics of a vanished world, but as living emblems of hope and faith. The fascination with Egypt has never faded. Explorers uncovered tombs buried for millennia. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, the world paused, and the breath of ancient time seemed to fill the modern air. Gold gleamed, but it was not the treasure itself that mattered. It was the feeling that across thousands of years, a voice had been heard again. Today, the Nile still flows. Cairo hums with life. The same stars that once shone above Thebes and Memphis now shimmer over the modern cities. And in the quiet places, amid the dunes and temples, time feels less like a line and more like a circle. The spirit of Egypt is eternal, calm, enduring, reflective. It reminds us that greatness is not only in conquest or power, but in patience, in order, and in wonder. As the night deepens, imagine the desert under moonlight. the pyramids silvered by the glow, the air still, the river whispering softly to itself. This is Egypt as it was and as it remains, ancient, infinite, and at peace. And now, as the stars move slowly over the horizon, the story of Egypt drifts into silence. The river still flows, the temples still stand, and the names of the ancients still linger in the dust. May their dreams keep watch over you tonight, steady as the Nile, gentle as the dawn. You've drifted through time with history for sleep. If tonight's journey brought you peace, let the next one find you too. Subscribe to History for Sleep, where every night another century fades gently into